Now let's talk a little bit about Jesus' part when the crucifixion. Jesus knew that his time had come. You know, there were plenty of opportunities in Jesus' life when crowds would gather around and they'd want to just drag him down and beat the crap out of him. But he'd always slide out the back. And a few times he said, "No, it's not my hour. Not time yet. Not time for me to go." But Jesus knew his time had come. So I want to take you back probably about, we're going to back up a little bit from Jesus hanging on the cross. I'm going to back up somewhere around, let's say about 12 hours. He knew it was time to go. He called his disciples, he called his best buddies together in a room, and they had the Last Supper. What we now do in your church is what you do. You may call it communion, or you may call it the Lord's Supper, where you come up and you take the bread and the wine and the juice, whatever. That's what you're doing. This is what Jesus took his friends up there to do. And he spent that last night preparing those guys to carry out his message, because he knew he wasn't going to be around probably long enough to see the sun go down again. So he stayed there and he prepared them for that. After the supper, we're going to go forward here. After that, he wanted to go into the Garden of Gethsemane to pray. He was tore up, folks. He was tore up because he knew what was coming. And he went to the garden and he just wanted to pray. And he talked to God. He said, "God, if there's any other way for this to be accomplished, can we please do it?" But he knew the answer. But he talked to God anyway. He talked to him all night, actually. He prayed all night. I've been real upset before about things. Normally something to do with, like, if one of my children were sick, and I would lay in bed, and I would just lay there in bed, and I would just pray, and I would pray, and I would pray. And I may pray 30 minutes, and I'd pray myself to sleep. I can honestly say I never prayed all night, but I've never been as upset, I guess, as Jesus was about this. So he prayed until the early hours of the morning, when one of his buddies stabbed him in the back, led the soldiers in there to him. And they chained him up, and they drug him off to go be tried in a fixed trial. The fix was in for him from the get-go. There was no not guilty coming out of this trial. Not to mention he was beaten on the way there for no other reason than they could beat him. I tell you, this story is beautiful, but it makes me so mad. Every time I think about it, and I would walk around my house, and I would walk around the house at night after everybody's asleep, and I'd go through this in my head, and I would get so mad every time. But they drug him out of that garden, and they beat him on the way there for no other reason than they could. They got him there, and he went through a series of false trials. It was so bogus. The people testifying couldn't even get their story straight. Everybody was contradicting the other person. It didn't matter. It didn't matter. It's up. He's guilty. You know the rest of the story. He goes before Pilate. He goes before Herod. Nobody can find anything wrong with him. I can't find any reason to find this guy guilty. But the crowd wouldn't have it any other way. And he was sentenced to death by crucifixion. Before Jesus was crucified, the Bible simply says that Jesus was scourged. And that's about it. But that's not about it. I want to paint another picture for you. Scourging was probably, I've never been scourged, or I've never been crucified, but when I weigh the two, I think I'd rather be crucified personally. They took Jesus. The Bible's kind of vague about this, so I'm going to try to fill the blanks in a little bit. But they took Jesus out after he was convicted and sentenced. And they tied his hands around a big wooden post. Call it a whipping post if you want to. They stripped him. I assume he still had his robe on at this point. It was probably torn and ripped and bloody from all the beatings that he had taken up to that point. But I would assume that they tied him around that pole and they stripped the clothes off his back. Shoulders, his back exposed. His legs. As much as they hated him, I would step out and say I wouldn't put it past them that they stripped him just flat naked right there and tied him around that post just to humiliate him even more. So here he is, hands above his head. He's laid out like this. His back to the crowd. And the executioner, we'll call him executioner, has something called a flagrum, or a cat of nine tails. Let me tell you about this jewel. What's that thing Indiana Jones uses? A bullwhip? Imagine that, but shorter. Had a handle and about 8 or 9 leather straps came off the handle. On the end of each one of those straps was a spiked metal ball. Embedded into those straps were hooks that were made of bone or metal. The metal balls were there basically to beat and to tenderize the skin every time it hit, kind of like you just beat and tenderize your steak. The hooks were there to do a little more damage. The hooks were there to tear, to rip, to cut into the flesh. The executioner grabbed the handle and he'd snap it across Jesus' back. And when it hit, those metal balls beat him, and those hooks dug in and they tore the skin and the hide right off of him. The Bible doesn't say how many times they did that, but I'm going to again step out and assume that their hatred for him, I would say he was beat quite a few times. And I don't know this, Brother Harold. It wouldn't put it past me if they didn't flip him over and do the other side. Jesus is probably lying there in shock at this point, covered in blood, in the most awful pain he probably ever been in his life. You've got to remember now, he's exhausted. He hadn't slept the night before. He'd been beaten repeatedly. He'd been through the false trials. And he lay there and he let them just beat him and never said a word back. He was beaten so bad you couldn't even tell who he was. About 700 years before this, a prophet named Isaiah said in jest that he would be unrecognizable. If you knew him before then, you wouldn't know him the next day after you saw him. I've watched quite a few movies about Jesus and his life, and they do a little portrayal of this, of when they beat him. And the Passion of the Christ, if you've seen that, that's pretty bad. But even after all that, he's hanging on the cross, he still looks like Jennifer Wiesel. Now, if you've seen Passion of the Christ and you see what he looked like, just think that probably times 2. And if that wasn't enough, they made a cross. A cross. Sorry. They made a crown of thorns. They didn't set it on his head. This crown of thorns, I'm not talking about a briar bush. I'm talking about thorns. They didn't place it on his head gently and fix his hair. They put it on and they probably snatched it down, and those thorns probably dug into his head. And the blood ran down in mockery because he is self-proclaimed King of the Jews.